I want to welcome everybody to this Middle East Forum event. My name is Scott Rosenblum, and I'm a member of the board of the Forum and a partner of Kramer Levin, host of today's briefing by Gerald Steinberg. You're welcome. First, a few words about the Middle East Forum. The Forum's mission is to define and promote American interests in the Middle East and help the United States defend itself against Islamist threats. The Forum accomplishes its mission intellectually by providing context, insights, and policy recommendations through its publications, operationally by exerting an active influence on the course of events through its projects, philanthropically by distributing $2 million earmarked funds annually, helping researchers, writers, investigators, and activists around the world. Specifically, some of the Forum's activities include the Washington Project, which monitors and influences U.S. policy in the Middle East, the Legal Project, which protects free speech about Islam and related topics, and protects writers and researchers from frivolous lawsuits and intimidation, the Campus Watch, which monitors extremism and bias in Middle East studies, Islamist Watch, which monitors nonviolent Islamist activities, and the Middle East Quarterly, a policy-oriented journal which provides cutting-edge information on the Middle East. The Forum's websites have received millions of visits, and I invite you to visit our website, meforum.org, for further information about the Forum's activities. I also hope you consider supporting the Forum financially. As a not-for-profit organization with a staff of 19 and a budget exceeding $1.5 million, the Forum relies on its tax-deductible contributions, which support a well-managed and lean, but highly productive and effective organization. Your contributions will be put to excellent use. As we begin, please switch off all cell phones and pagers. We ask that you hold comments and questions until after the formal presentation ends. And now it is my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, Gerald Steinberg. Gerald Steinberg was former chair of the Political Studies Department at Bar-Ilan University, where he currently teaches. He was also a consultant to the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, participates in the Inter-Parliamentary Coalition for Combating Anti-Semitism, and is a member of the Academic Advisory Board of the Israel Law Review. In 2002, he founded NGO Monitor, of which he is president, to promote accountability and advance a vigorous discussion on the reports and activities of NGOs which claim to promote moral agendas such as humanitarian aid and human rights. His op-ed columns appear in the Jerusalem Post, Wall Street Journal Europe, Financial Times, National Review Online, International Herald Tribune, and other publications. And he's a frequent commentator on CBC, NPR, the BBC, as well as others. Today, Mr. Steinberg will discuss the recent wave of attempts to demonize and isolate Israel and offer ideas on ways to counter this campaign. Please welcome Gerald Steinberg.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out. I was going to start by thanking Daniel Pipes, but Daniel and I are playing the keep the skies balanced, so he's off in Israel and Jerusalem actually speaking, and I'm here. But I do want to thank the Middle East Forum, which I've been associated with in different ways for I think more years than I care to count. And I think that a lot of the work that we do is very, very much in common. I always think of NGO Monitor as filling a need that wasn't recognized, and I'll explain to you why it wasn't recognized and why this need needs to be filled. We're all dealing with the same major war, the war of the 21st century, in different ways. And those issues need to be dealt with. In fact, before I talk about Israel, I want to talk about the broader issue of the way in which human rights and moral values, moral principles, international law, humanitarian aid have become very cynically exploited for what I guess is best stated as the opposite of what they were intended for. Most of what we use now in terms of the language of human rights, in terms of what's called dealing with warfare, asymmetric warfare, war crimes, international law, law of armed conflict, this is we're in a law office, right? So if the lawyers here, these are all international law. This has become a very dominant part of the language of that process. Was developed very much in the shadow of the Holocaust. And like the United Nations, I'm hesitant to use the word naive, so I will say idealistic. These were very idealistic projects, concepts, with the complete shock of what happened in the Holocaust, the complete anger at the way in which human beings had so been degraded, that there had to be something different that was set up. And in the context of the United Nations in 1948, the United Nations adopted a universal, and each word is important, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's what the UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in 1948. Also a genocide, a convention that banned genocide, and eventually most of the countries of the world signed on to that framework. And it created a very broad infrastructure. The United Nations, first the Commission on Human Rights was set up, and then the United Nations Human Rights Council, and later on the International Criminal Court was created, and a whole group of non-governmental organizations which were developed under the auspices of these frameworks to promote these very values. What was later became Human Rights Watch, originally Helsinki Watch, was developed by a gentleman named Robert Bernstein, who came back from having, as chairman of Random House, CEO of Random House, negotiating agreements and having met Sakharov and become acquainted later on with Sharansky's story, decided that this was something that he could not sit by while these people were having their human rights violated, and he created Helsinki Watch, which became Human Rights Watch. And around the same time, or a little bit earlier, Amnesty International was created to go out and defend prisoners of conscience in closed societies. Now we're in a completely different situation. We are 30 years, 35 years after those organizations were created, and these very frameworks have become very much the enemies of human rights. They've created a whole, what I call, parallel universe, in which the human rights violators are the United States, and Israel, and NATO, and democracies. And Human Rights Watch was talking 2 years ago about how the Gaddafi family was instituting reforms, and the Gaddafi Foundation was creating what they called the Tripoli Spring. That this was like the Prague Spring. They were raising money in Saudi Arabia not to help women. Human rights, even to drive in Saudi Arabia. They went to human rights explicitly in order to raise funds so that they could fight what they called the pro-Israel lobby. That was me. That was at the time of the Gaza war, and afterwards to support the Goldstone accusations, the notorious Goldstone report. Human Rights Council. Well, I went to a Human Rights Council meeting in 2009, just before the Durban II conference. It was chaired by the representative from this great human rights bastion, Libya. And Iran and Cuba and all of their friends were voting for one issue, and that's the Article 7 of Condemn Israel. And I could just talk about this in general, but what I'm saying is that this is a big, broad issue. And I'll go a little bit further, and I don't want to talk, I'll talk about the Israel-specific issues, but this is not only about Israel. One of the reasons the United States has not been able to sustain its position in Afghanistan or Iraq is because every time that there's a claim of a civilian being killed, it immediately stops the entire process. Now, nobody's in favor of killing civilians, but the allegations of deliberate attacks against civilians, or disproportionality, or violation of international law, all of these terms that are thrown around very loosely, and again, primarily against democratic societies, except if the big issue, I won't go into the exceptions right now, I'll talk about that later. These forced, we had an incident where, there are a series of incidents, where either real or manufactured claims that in trying to prevent killing of civilians by Taliban or by Al-Qaeda in Iraq, There are allegations that civilians were killed, and immediately the entire process of self-defense against terror comes to a halt. And this happens over and over again. And this has become very much part of modern warfare. And I would even argue that it's become the main principle of modern, what's called asymmetric warfare. If you can be perceived, if you can claim victimhood, if you can say that the other side is killing civilians indiscriminately, unjustifiably, or just plain killing civilians, whether it's true or not. And let's remember that most of the accusations against Israel have been proven to be false. In Gaza and Lebanon and other places, and I'll give you specific examples, or in Jenin, then immediately, if you're a Western democratic society, you are unable to defend your interests. This abuse of the language of human rights has permeated modern international relations, the relation between states, and that's really what this is all about. And until I realized how absolutely powerful these organizations were, there's nobody watching the watchers. You've got organizations like Human Rights Watch, which is, I think, headquartered not far from here. It's got a budget of around 50 million, plus Soros just offered to provide another 10 million, we're not quite sure in how many years. That's almost an infinite budget. And Amnesty has a huge budget. And you have dozens of these organizations in Europe and elsewhere. There is no other example I can think of in Western society where they have so much power and so little accountability, so little transparency, so little analysis. And the abuse is so great, and that's what led me to begin to look at this, to move from, as Nina always reminds me, from my days of being a quiet physicist, or not such a quiet physicist, looking at all sorts of other issues and saying this is something that has to be addressed. It's like a huge imbalance in the world of nature where something has to be corrected, and I decided that was what was necessary to be done. This is the I talked briefly about the Human Rights Council. The majority of the countries on the Human Rights Council, the bastion of human rights, the majority are either countries from the Organization of the Islamic Conference or their allies. 2/3 of the countries are not in any way democratic. And I listed some of the names. Because the OIC, the Organization of the Islamic Conference, has so many votes, and it's able to distribute in such a way they've concentrated their ability to influence the UN in the UN Human Rights Council, which means that the only country they've talked about on a regular basis is Israel. It's a permanent agenda item. And in the last couple of years, 27 out of 33 resolutions focused on Israel. I won't go through all the details, that's not the primary purpose of my talk, but what I am saying is that the institutions have been completely corrupted. I saw this trigger that got me into this and to realize that there needs to be some sort of accountability, some sort of a process, which became NGO Monitor, was the Durban Conference of 2001, where there was an NGO forum that was attended by 1,500 organizations, including the organizations I just mentioned, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and many others, under the banner of human rights, under the sponsorship of the UN, in those days, Commission for Human Rights. It was chaired by Mary Robinson. And 1,500 NGOs participated, and they adopted what we all know now, what we recognize now as the language of BDS, of Israel Apartheid. This is, for those of you who missed it, this is one of 3 Israel Apartheid weeks. Israel Apartheid Week lasts a month now. And this is I think we're in the second week now in some campuses. And if you look at the language that was adopted by the NGO Forum of the 2001 Durban Conference, this is the blueprint for what we call the BDS sewer system that you have in front of you. This is the blueprint for how are we going to wage war against Israel politically. We're going to repeatedly use the words racist apartheid. This is not a policy of opposing specific, this is not about opposing specific policies. Sometimes you'll hear it said that this is only about opposing settlements, and many Israelis are opposed to settlements and the occupation. If you read the language, these organizations are not opposed to Israeli policy, they're opposed to Israel. And they make it very clear. Ali Abu Mina, Electronic Intifada, one of the main speakers at every Israel Apartheid Week event, Omar Barghouti, the perennial PhD student at Tel Aviv University, who runs the Palestinian, what's it called, PACB, the Palestinian whatever it is, for boycotts of Israel, the Palestinian Committee for the Boycott of Israel, they make it very clear their goal is the elimination of the Jewish state. And the language that was adopted by these NGOs at Durban repeats the word racist, apartheid, and the bottom line is calls upon the international community to impose a policy of complete and total isolation of Israel as an apartheid state. That's the goal. Not to change Israeli policies. And that's what they've been doing for 8 or 9 years. And before somebody asks me a question, I will already say the Israeli government had no clue. They were asleep at the wheel. They didn't take it seriously. They didn't even see it at all until a year or two afterwards. A year or two ago. Still got the jet lag. The NGOs, I argue, these organizations that wear a halo around their head, that are largely immune from criticism, or they were at least until we got into the business and then it began to develop further, very often are the engines. They are the ones who will use the language of human rights. They will issue a report. They will be seen as authoritative. They'll be quoted on NPR and CBC and in the New York Times and across the board. And you won't be amazed. I was amazed when I first saw it, how automatically the media picks up these reports without asking any questions. And then, after the media puts it on as a headline story, then it gets debated at the UN through the same process I talked about, and diplomats will then issue condemnations, and it happens repeatedly, and I can give you 25 examples in the last 10 years. And then, of course, it gets quoted in the books by my academic colleagues. Richard Goldstone is perhaps the culmination of this process, finding a South African Jewish judge to put his name on a report that was largely written by these NGOs, which condemns Israel in 500 pages with allegations of war crimes and recommends that action be taken against Israel, because Israel cannot act like a grown-up. Israel doesn't have a functioning military court system for dealing with war crimes, they say. And every boycott, divestment, and sanction BDS or Israel Apartheid Week rally waves the Goldstone report as proof